Did we really land on the moon? Well, there were 13 Saturn V launches on one hand, but on the other hand, some guy says it didn't happen. Hi, everybody. I'm here with Scott Ott and Steve Green, and this is your special right angle brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com who have decided that they would rather see everybody watch these episodes than keep it unto themselves. So that's always a cheerful mood. Guys, needless to say, in the work I've been doing on the Apollo 11 thing, I didn't deal with the moon landing hoax and so on in the series. I had enough ground to cover with what actually happened to waste on this. But I am going to address the moon landing hoax in a firewall and hopefully have that by the end of this week. But here's my point. There are two things here that I find really interesting, and the first of them is this. I went and listened to virtually every moon landing is a hoax video I could find because I wanted to hear what the other side was saying. And that is a form of intellectual integrity that's kind of part of this ability to weigh evidence and make decisions. And the second thing is I was shocked and stunned, as I often am, at how absolutely sparse and how unbelievably thin the evidence on the side of the conspiracy people really is. But that's not, I don't want to talk about the moon landing as a conspiracy. I want to talk about this. How do we know what's real in a world where we have all of this information and people telling us one thing and people telling us something else? How do we know what's real? How do we weigh evidence? How can we as individual people have some sort of method to employ to help us find out what's true? Steve, when I was in debate in high school, I learned a lot. But the thing I learned the most, and I never forgot it, in fact, I remember it happening to me. I was like 17. I remember, don't forget this. What I found in debate was that whatever the topic was, and for us that year, the debate topic was prison reform. No matter what the element was, let's say, does the death penalty cut murder rates? I would find page after page after page after page of evidence, studies, experts saying that capital punishment did not lower the murder rate. And then I also found pages and pages and pages of experts and studies that said capital punishment definitely lowers the murder rate. And that's when I began to realize that anybody on any position out there can trot out somebody who looks good and sounds good and may in fact be really knowing what they're talking about. But comes a point when you have to start asking yourself some pretty simple questions about logic and what's real. And it seems to me that this ability, which used to be so common among Americans as a practical people, is pretty much utterly gone today. How do you know, Steve, when you're editing Instapundit or coming up with shows for this, what gives you an idea of what's actually real versus what is just something that's clearly not?
Well, I was going to say that's the trick, isn't it? But the thing is, sometimes we get it wrong. We try not to, but we get it wrong. And when you're called out on being wrong, unlike my segment this week, you don't double down on stupid. You say, oh, well, I guess I got to change my mind. I guess I've got to get my brain in accordance with reality. And we find these things out in any number of ways. One of the simplest, of course, is Occam's razor. If you've watched science fiction movies from the 1960s, you know that Hollywood pretty much sucked at it. It was just really awful. 2001 is the only exception I can think of that. The exterior spaceship shots were amazing. Kubrick was actually shooting these things in the dark, practically. He wanted the realest possible lighting that he could get, which meant very little lighting at all. And if I remember correctly, something like the exterior shots of the
Discovery.
Thank you, of the Discovery were shot at some obscene rate of 1 frame per second, because that's how long the shutter had to be open to get an exposure of this ship. And so you get
to get the depth of field.
Yeah,
what it was, so that you see the front and the back would both be sharp.
Yes, just incredibly difficult, painstaking to do, and people thrilled over it in large part because they'd never seen anything like it. It was incredible. You didn't see the little silvery flashes of the wires in the background. around or anything like that. It was very difficult to do, and only Kubrick could do that in 1968. It was actually easier, and this is where Occam's razor comes in. It was actually easier for NASA to launch a multi-billion-dollar series of manned missions than it would have been for them to try and fake it, because rocket technology existed. The special effects technology to fake it did not. And the other thing is, once your mind is made up, once you are correct, once you are in accordance with reality, we're up against something really harsh here, Bill. And this is the thing I really want to say about this. I can't remember whose law it is, but it's the law states that it's 10 times more difficult to refute BS than it is to throw the BS out there. And it doesn't mean we have to do it any less. It does mean that maybe we need to think about how we do it a little differently. One of my favorite fake moon landing websites ever was actually a parody of fake moon landing websites. And this thing's got to be at least 15 years old. It goes back to the fairly early days of being able to do digital photography well on the internet. And they played with, if you've seen these photos where you've got the little arrows pointing, this is where the stars would be showing up if this were an actual photograph. Mm-hmm. And so they've got that, the little arrow showing this is where the stars should be if this were an actual photograph taken from the moon. Meanwhile, you've got these obviously hand-drawn cartoon pig monkeys or whatever they were climbing up the ladder of the lunar lander that are being totally ignored by these so-called experts. And it's just a beautiful lampoon of these people. And that is... Actually, no, that one's in second place. I think the best response to this was Buzz Aldrin's about 10, 12 years ago when he just decked a guy for saying that Buzz Aldrin, the second human to walk on another astral body, had not actually done so. And Buzz Aldrin hauled off and decked him.
He decked him not because he said he didn't walk on the moon. He decked him because he called him a coward and a traitor and a liar.
That's right. I stand corrected.
Them's fighting words.
I have been corrected, and I've admitted my error, and now my mind is in accordance with reality. It's a great place to be.
It surely is. Scott, there was a period there when I saw a documentary about Shakespeare that made the case that the works of William Shakespeare were actually written by De Vere, the 16th Earl of Oxford, I think he was, Edward de Vere. And this thing made some compelling points. And by the time that documentary was finished, plus they did a feature film on it called Anonymous, I think it was, I spent about a week and a half utterly convinced that a great injustice had been done, and that I, from this point forward, was going to make it clear that I was going to name the actual authors of King Lear and so on, who was Edward de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford. And then, reluctantly, I said to myself, maybe I ought to look at why so many people think that William Shakespeare wrote the words of William Shakespeare. and in the space of about 25 minutes, I realized how suckered I had been by this. And I'll just give you one example, very simple example. One of the things I found most compelling was that William of Stratford, had two daughters who he loved very much, and neither of them could read. It's inconceivable that the greatest writer of all time, his daughters couldn't read. I mean, it's just, how do you get around that? Get around it because no women in England were educated at all, unless you were royalty. 70 years after Shakespeare died, they started to do this. There wasn't a woman in England who could write her name. Hardly any of the men could write their names. I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so, boom, all of a sudden, all of this stuff that is so compelling taken alone just kind of falls apart. But that's when I realized that the people who are selling me this Edward de Vere thing either are aware of this or they should be. And that the actual hoax that's going on is the hoax on the part of people like Eric von Donigan, who tell you that these hummingbird shapes on the Nazca Plain are actually parking ramps for alien flying saucers, makes a great case for it, and neglects to mention that the total wingspan is maybe 14 feet. In other words, flying saucers this big. We leave that part out. What do you say about this? How do you determine what's true?
Well, first of all, I think it's universally acknowledged that the reason why it's not possible for a man to land on the moon is because the moon is only roughly this big, and it's wafer thin. And
Wafer
so
thin.
I just saw that last night. I looked up at the moon and I thought, no wonder they never landed on the moon, because first of all, you'd have to have really tiny feet to even step onto the moon. And secondly, it's so thin it would snap like a communion cracker. And so I just don't think
A lot of
that's...
people think. I'm sorry. I bet you there's a lot of people think the government has a shrink ray, but landing on the moon is just impossible.
Chemtrails.
It's interesting because there are some people who have responded to your Apollo series and have emailed us, insisting that you really examine the facts for yourself and that you don't want to be a dupe of the government.
I don't.
One of the tests that you put to something, my training is in journalism, and so you're trying to determine the truth of a matter, and so you try to talk to a variety of sources who could provide eyewitness testimony to something that happened. And ideally, you get eyewitness testimony from people who are not in collusion with each other. So you want, Donald Trump was way ahead of, or was kind of right in the tradition of journalism. No collusion. You want to find a group of people who don't have any obvious connection with each other, who will say the same thing. And if you get that, and particularly even better would be a bunch of people who not only don't have anything in common, but actually have a lot of things not in common, that would be in disagreement with each other over most major things. Let's say, I don't know, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Democrats and hundreds of thousands of Republicans who would all give testimony to the fact that they watched a rocket launch off a pad in Cape Canaveral, for example. Those people have no reason to conspire with each other to promulgate this myth. The other thing is, if you were faking a moon landing, would you do what they did and what you can see in the first episode of Bill Whittle's series, What We Saw, the Apollo 11 series? Would you, on the screen, at the ultimate moment of triumph, would you show on the screen something that looked a little more primitive than a Galaxians game and a clock? And so, it's basically this sort of fake, clearly fake, not intended to look real, little cartoony kind of
CBS animation
rocket ship. Yeah. Like if you're really going to fake this, even in the 1960s, we had the technology to do something a little more believable than just like this cheesy looking Scooby-Doo rocket ship and a clock that was ticking down. It doesn't make any sense. And Occam's razor is certainly another test that you apply to that. It's like, if there's a simple explanation, why come up with a complicated explanation? Bill points out in his series that in order to simulate the kind of movement of dust that we saw on the lunar surface, you would have to be able to have a vacuum chamber to do that, because that dust moved that way because it was in a vacuum, and that the largest vacuum chamber on Earth would essentially not be big enough to contain the lunar expeditionary module, the craft that they landed on the moon in.
let alone the 12-mile live journeys on the rover.
Yeah. So anyway, there's so many reasons, and I don't feel like going through and debunking it, because I got to be very honest with you, Bill. And God bless you. I mean, as we would say in church, if those of you who believe that we didn't actually land on the moon, bless your heart. But I just feel like I'm not even compelled to argue with you. And I don't care if you think I'm a moron or a dupe or I've been suckered by the government.
Thank you.
Or anything. I really don't care. You've given away your entire credibility by coming up with this plausible theory of not landing on the moon. And I'll finish with this. I walked out of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, shocked and stunned. And at the end, there's this scene where LBJ basically turns to his military guys and says, okay, you got your damn war. Mm-hmm. So essentially, like, this whole thing had been engineered, the assassination of President Kennedy had been engineered so that the militaristic, bloodthirsty guys, could get their war in Vietnam. And it was done and Oliver Stone's a very accomplished filmmaker.
It's very convincing.
Yes. And you walk out of there going, ooh, that could happen. And then your next thought is, ooh, it didn't. and I think to all your theories about not landing on the moon, ooh, that could happen. It didn't.
Well, it's certainly been my experience of other people that trying to argue this on the basis of evidence is futile, because this is not an intellectual argument; it's an emotional argument. And so sometimes the way to do that is to argue it as an emotional argument. One of the things I didn't get a chance to do, but I'm looking forward to doing, is basically to say this. Let's say you're a millennial who believes that this didn't happen because we didn't have the computing power. Okay, now just play along with me here. Let's say it's 50 years from now, and you're in your 60s or 70s, and you're enjoying all of the entertainment available by the neural implants that are directly in your brain that allow you to simply visualize yourself anywhere you want to be, and there you are. And somebody comes into one of these dreamlike programs that go on in your head and tells you that human sports that you saw never happened. Baseball is a fraud. You would say, what? It's complete fraud. There's no way that a person could do the mental calculations necessary to determine the vector, the altitude, gravitational pull, drag, all of this stuff. The idea that a human being without these neural implants could simply just see a ball get hit in the air and then suddenly miraculously end up in exactly the right place where this ball's going to land. I mean, this big, he's going to just somehow miraculously do the math in his head and all the calculations to put himself in such a place where the ball lands in his glove. It's insane. It's ridiculous. It's a hoax. You thought you saw it, but all you ever saw was computer graphics. Now, you would feel the same way I feel. You would feel like, first of all, I saw it with my own eyes. But here's the point I'm trying to make. Somebody would make an assertion. They would make a statement that something's not possible. And it's something you saw happen. And it's something that you know is completely possible. And when then somebody comes along and talks to this guy and says, look, man, the reason that this is able to be done by human beings, it's not like the ball hits the bat and at that point the outfielder closes his eyes and runs directly to the exact spot he needs to be in, holds up the glove and catches the ball. The reason an outfielder can catch the ball is because he is making constant course corrections to get to where he needs to be in this feedback loop between where he is and where that ball is going to be. That's exactly what NASA did when they flew to the moon. They didn't have to have supercomputers. We're going on this trajectory. You guys are starting to drift to the left a little. Well, let's correct that out. 6, 7 burns later, you're where you need to be because you are constantly correcting the data. And sometimes an emotional argument like that will get through, you know? Sometimes it will. But I've had many people tell me, don't even bother, don't even argue with them, it's just a waste of time. I don't believe in that. I do believe that it is a waste of time to convince the true believers. I think that I think you could fly them to the moon and they wouldn't believe it. They're so invested in it and so on. But there are millions and millions and millions of people who've fallen into the Edward de Vere trap of having heard 2 or 3 things that sound very, very convincing and have never heard the other side of it. For instance, the Van Allen radiation belts are tilted at an angle to the moon's orbit, so you can just plain fly right over them. No one particularly mentions that when they're talking about astronauts being fried like they're in a microwave. So anyway, the truth is the truth. And what a guy says is an assertion that you never saw a baseball game or there's no way a quarterback could lead a receiver and do the mental calculations necessary to throw that ball in the exact spot down the field where this guy's going to be. Somebody tells you that didn't happen, it hurts and it pisses you off. And it should. So sometimes it's better to believe your own lying eyes rather than what somebody tells you is absolutely true because they have a tape someplace that they're not able to play for you just at this second. But believe me, when you hear it, you'll be convinced. That'll do it for this edition of Right Angle, brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. We've had a bunch of people come in as a result of the Apollo thing. Welcome. Glad to have you here. We sell common sense and decency. That's pretty much our product. So if that sounds like a good menu to you, we're very glad to have you here. And we're looking forward to doing more shows for you in the future. Till next week, I'm Bill Whittle for Steve Green and Scott Ott. This is Right Angle, and we'll see you then.